As the Prime Minister of Australia, he continues to remain one of the most respected voices in Asia Pacific. Take a look at our first session today.
Asia Pacific to Indo-Pacific. A small change of one word, but geopolitically a giant leap to a new world order. Reflective of India's growing significance as a global force. A nation that has embraced the new order with open arms is Australia. A beacon of democracy and freedom, Australia is home to almost 1 million Indians. And one of the few countries to have an economic strategy specific to India. Tony Abbott is a man who has played a pivotal role in reshaping India-Australia ties. A man intimately familiar with India, its people, and its history. As a young man, Mr. Abbott traveled across India and also worked as a teacher's aide in an Australian Jesuit school in Bihar. A decade ago, as Australia's Prime Minister, Mr. Abbott forged new ties with India. Although now retired from active politics, Mr. Abbott's vision and dedication continue to elevate the India-Australia relations to ever newer heights. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Tony Abbott, former Prime Minister of Australia.
Welcome, sir. Welcome, the Honourable Mr. Tony Abbott, sir. Before we ask you to deliver your keynote address, may I please also call upon stage MD and CEO TV9 Network, Mr. Barun Das, to please come up on stage, sir, and felicitate the Honourable former Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Tony Abbott. A loud round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. There you have it. Thank you so much, sir. I'm now going to have to request the former Prime Minister of Australia, Honourable Mr. Tony Abbott, to request him to deliver the global keynote address, the first of day 2. Over to you, sir.
Well, thank you. And I have to say, what a wonderful introduction, what a wonderful event, and how marvellous it is to be here in this fantastic country at this important time. Now, I have to say that for a long time, some outsiders said of India, it's a country of great potential and always will be. To those sceptics, I declare that modern India remains a country of vast potential, but is already a country of great achievement. It's already the world's 5th largest economy, the fastest growing large economy, and will be the 3rd largest within a couple of decades. It's still a developing country, but at least 80% of Indians, or something like 1.1 billion people, now have access to proper sanitation. Over 90% have access to good drinking water, and 97% have access to reliable power. Small things, maybe, in a geopolitical context, but they make a massive difference to people's lives. Thanks to the digital revolution, nearly every Indian adult is now economically and socially connected. There's long been a legendary rail network, but India is now building airports at the rate of 8 a year, urban metro systems at the rate of 1.5 a year, and national highways at the rate of 30 kilometres every single day. Last year, India became just the 4th country to land a space probe on the moon. And after several decades of the licence Raj, India is now roaring down the runway to economic takeoff. Companies such as the Ambani Group, Tata and Infosys are among the world's largest. There are 3 Indians among the world's 50 richest people, and there's now any number of ethnic Indians at the helm of major global businesses. And India isn't just the world's largest democracy, it's also one of the oldest, having been continuously democratic with just one tiny wobble for more than 3/4 of a century. India's democracy is older than Germany's and Spain's. It's older than France's Fifth Republic. India has had more changes of government than Japan. Its media is as free as America's, and its judiciary is as robustly independent as Britain's. India has long proven that a country need not be rich to be free, and it's now proving that freedom is no obstacle to rapid economic development. Yet mysteriously, India often ranks well down the global democracy lists produced by Freedom House and others. Perhaps that's because they think of Prime Minister Modi as a Hindu nationalist, when I think he's better called an Indian patriot who necessarily takes Hinduism seriously as by far the country's biggest creed. Sadly, faith in God and love of country are pretty rare in Western think tanks, which is why they find India's democracy easier to caricature than to understand. As Prime Minister a decade back, I used to describe India as, quote, the world's emerging democratic superpower. Under Modi, India is no longer a bystander, but increasingly a force in the world as one of the 2 democratic superpowers. And I'm confident that if there is to be a leader of the free world 50 or 100 years hence, it's as likely to be the Indian Prime Minister as the United States President. India has always been the superpower of the subcontinent. It's never been the aggressor in its wars and tensions, which it's always tried to resolve quickly, fairly, and in ways that allow others to be the best they can. And now, global leadership is beckoning. For a long time, India was a leader of the non-aligned movement, trying to stay aloof from big global struggles. Now, India is a leader of the global south, and as such speaks up for poorer countries to get the fair go they deserve, for all to have the respect and the national independence that India won for itself against the superpower of the day that was slow to acknowledge India's right to be free. To that end, India has now helped to form a new partnership for freedom and development. Unlike NATO, the Quad is not American-led. Indeed, it would not exist but for Shinzo Abe's foresight and determination, and for Narendra Modi's perception and magnanimity. Unlike NATO, the Quad is not a military alliance. Unlike NATO, it lacks formal structures. It's actually a bit like the Five Eyes, a largely informal network based on shared values, common interests and high ideals that's nonetheless helped to keep the peace for 7 decades. As Foreign Minister Jaishankar said on the weekend, the Quad is, quote, here to stay, here to grow, and here to contribute. And if that works out, with annual leaders' summits and scheduled officials' meetings, it certainly could be the most important strategic initiative since NATO. Even though it's not against anyone, it's for the rights of all to be free and aims to help all to be better off in a world of peace, national freedom and international cooperation to tackle global problems like underdevelopment, infrastructure poverty and environmental degradation. But that does mean standing strong against those who would breach the peace. The militarist, Islamist and communist dictatorships that think they have a right to impose their systems on others and that could, if mishandled, plunge the world into a new dark age. The Russian dictator thinks he's on a mission from God to destroy Ukraine, even though its people have every right to look west rather than east. Apocalyptic Islam seeks a new Holocaust, expunging Israel from the river to the sea. And communist China bullies its neighbours, even India, as part of its oft-declared intention to be the global hegemon by 2050. Its next step is taking Taiwan, by force if necessary, a practically independent country of 25 million people that's never been under communist rule, that's hardly ever been governed from Beijing, and that's living, breathing proof that there's no totalitarian gene in the Chinese DNA. Now, as a backpacker in India 40 years ago, I spent 3 weeks in Bokaro Steel City as a kind of teacher's aide at St Xavier's School. So I do understand the practical help that the old Soviet Union gave to India at a critical time when the United States unwisely was tilting to Pakistan. And I can understand why India is reluctant to be publicly critical of Russia for historical and practical reasons, although PM Modi did indeed upbraid the Russian dictator at Samarkand for using war as an act of national policy. Even so, I've yet to meet an Indian who doesn't think that the wanton destruction of Ukrainian cities without the slightest attempt to minimise civilian casualties is simply evil. With greater strength comes greater responsibility. And that's my sense of where Prime Minister Modi is taking India. And it couldn't come at a more critical time. When India helps to preserve freedom of navigation in the Arabian Sea, that's not taking America's side against Iran. That's protecting the global commons. Likewise, any country that helped Taiwan to resist a Chinese invasion wouldn't be on the side of America against China, but on the side of democracy versus dictatorship. Were India to help Taiwan, a bit like it helped Bangladesh 5 decades back, far from playing the great power politics it's always deplored, it would be helping the weak against the strong in the eternal struggle to heed the better angels of our natures. The best hope of avoiding great power conflict in coming years is for free peoples everywhere to make it clear that an attack on one small country is an attack on everyone. So, my friends, there is no doubt that this will be an Indo-Pacific century, but with its unshakable commitment to democracy and the rule of law, let's hope that this Indo-Pacific century turns out to be more India's than China's.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. I now request you to stay on stage. May I also call upon TV9 Network's our Sridharan to join Mr. Abbott for a keynote interview.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first session of Day 2, News9 Global Summit. Mr. Abbott, let me start by thanking you, first of all, for what I thought was a very honest and an accurate assessment of where India is today. Why don't we see more such honesty from more Western leaders?
Well, it's easier to be honest when you're retired. That's the sad truth. And probably being a bit too candid too often was one of the reasons why I was retired a little bit earlier than I would have liked.
So, no, but on a more serious note, if you look at the issue that we are facing with Canada as well, where there seems to be a total lack of appreciation of the problems, what India calls a problem, from a Canadian perspective, that extremists are allowed to operate from foreign soil and attack India. And some countries don't want to recognize that as a problem. So what would you say to such countries?
Well, if there were a nest of people operating in New Zealand, for argument's sake, who were determined to create mayhem and violence in Australia, we would be very keen as Australians to have the New Zealand government crack down on such individuals. And certainly I thought it was a mistake for the Australian government recently to readily permit entry into Australia of people from the United Kingdom and Canada who were known to be deeply subversive agitators, if you like, coming to Australia not for tourism, which we welcome, but for politics, which frankly we would rather not have amongst people claiming to be tourists. So I think a government such as Australia's and the Friends of India more generally need to be careful about allowing things to happen in their countries which make it needlessly difficult for the Indian government here at home. That said, obviously it is important for the Indian government here at home to be decent, respectful, to appreciate that in a democracy there will be dissent, that people are entitled to argue for a better chance and a fairer go for different parts of the country and so on. But it's one thing to say that the central government might not have been as sympathetic as it should have been to places X or Y. It's another thing to want to create violence and indeed secessionism inside the country.
Right. Now, I want to ask you a personal question, Mr. Abbott. You've known our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, rather intimately over the last 10 years, and you have described him as a transformative leader. So when you've been a Prime Minister yourself, you're a global statesman. So what do you think makes him a transformative leader? How is he different from other global leaders that you interact with?
Well, there's probably three things, I suppose, about Prime Minister Modi. One, extremely unusual. One, unusual in an Indian context. And one, I would say, necessary for any effective leadership. The extremely unusual thing about Prime Minister Modi is that as a young man, he was sufficiently spiritually minded to spend at least a year as a virtual monk in the Himalayas. Now, as someone who spent 3 years in a seminary myself, before realising that I was a square peg in a round hole, I appreciate someone who gets that the world is not just the here and now. It's not just all about money and materialism. And I think that adds a dimension to Prime Minister Modi which is rare and that people can sense. And I think the inspirational quality that he brings ties back to that. The other thing about Prime Minister Modi is that he is in no sense an establishment figure. He doesn't come from an established business or political dynasty. And at least in the early days, he had no links with any such things. And given that for a long time, India was dominated by the Congress, which tended to be very much the establishment, I think in that sense, Prime Minister Modi has been a people's voice in a way that a lot of national politicians haven't always been. The third thing is that he's had an agenda. He has wanted India to be less of a bystander and more of an actor on the global stage. He has wanted the Indian economy to be more efficient. He has wanted the ordinary lives of Indians to be better. I mean, the drive to electrify the couple of 100 million Indians, to electrify the lives of the couple of 100 million Indians who had no access to reliable power. They're transformative, completely transformative. I mean, the drive to extend proper sanitation to hundreds of millions of people. I mean, I can remember what India was like 40 years ago in terms of sanitation. And okay, it's not a big deal geopolitically, but by God, it makes a difference. So I think he's had a very strong domestic agenda. Help people's lives in practical ways, strengthen the country in practical ways through infrastructure and so on, and as best you can, given the fact that you can't push the envelope too far, try to liberalise and reform the economy.
Right. So you touched upon in your speech how India is now emerging as a leader of the global south. But when we look around the world, there's still a lot of reluctance among, especially the developed nations, the Western nations, to admit that there might be a larger role for India in that sort of a scenario. Why do you think the world is still not ready to accept that India is actually the default leader for global south?
Look, the global south is not a term I particularly like or use myself. I mean, the global south seems to be shorthand for countries that feel they haven't always got a fair go. Now, I accept that in many cases that's the case. But personally, I would rather be involved in a leadership role in a community of values rather than simply a community of disadvantage or perceived victimhood. And I don't think the developed world, in inverted commas, is at all reluctant to see India in a leading role. The Quad is a classic example of three developed countries' eagerness to see India taking a leadership role. And I know this might be hard to credit, and I know it's not something that America is always very good at in practice, but I think at least in principle, the Americans understand that the Quad will only work if India is at least as much its leader as the United States. Right. This is not an American-led partnership. This is a partnership of equals, at least where India and America are concerned. Right. And if the Americans forget that, the Quad won't work.
Right. You touched upon China in your speech, Mr. Abbott. I want to ask you a very straight question. How real is a scenario where China actually attacks Taiwan and tries to take over the country?
A government which ultimately is based on fear cannot afford to make threats that it doesn't carry out. And the Beijing regime routinely threatens to take Taiwan by force if necessary, and routinely promises its own people that it will be the global hegemon by mid-century. I think there's no doubt that China would have moved on Taiwan years ago if it thought it could get away with it. Obviously, until quite recently, there was no real match between China and America militarily. Today, there are enormous questions over whether the American Navy could operate in the Western Pacific without suffering massive losses in a full-scale conflict with China. That means that China's ability to take Taiwan is growing by the day. Now, I don't think China wants war. I think that China wants to win without war. That's the classic, the art of war, is it not? To win without fighting. So I think that's what China would prefer. But let's not be under any misapprehension. The thing that drives the Chinese leadership every moment of every day, other than their preservation in power, is to overcome the century of humiliation and having snuffed out the practical freedom of Hong Kong in violation of the treaty that they signed, they are now absolutely focused on taking Taiwan as quickly as they can, if possible, without a fight. But every day there is grey zone warfare going on against Taiwan. Every day there is military belligerence being practiced against Taiwan. And if they think the rest of the world, particularly the United States, is sufficiently distracted by other things, if they think that perhaps their own position is becoming fragile and needs to be shored up by a foreign adventure, that is when I think we are at a point of maximum danger.
Right. So, Mr. Abbott, we already have two regional conflicts happening. One, Russia, Ukraine, then between Israel and Palestine. Is the world maybe just a badly aimed nuclear tactical missile away from a nuclear war? I mean, how grave is a global conflict likely, to your mind? How do you rate the chances of a global conflagration?
Look, I hate talking about this because the Great War was horrific. The Second World War was even worse. And a new global conflict would be by several orders of magnitude worse than anything we've ever seen before. I mean, the statement of Einstein, I don't know how the next war will be fought, but the one after that will be fought with sticks and stones. I mean, I think there is much in that depressing observation. So I think we've got to do everything we humanly can to avoid it. But weakness is not the way to avoid the next conflict. Weakness is provocative. The only way to keep the peace is to maintain deterrence. And that doesn't mean being crazy brave, but it certainly means being strong enough to let any substantial aggressor know that aggression will not pay because the price is just too high. Now, to go to the Ukraine, if Ukraine is not supported, at least at the level that it has been up till now, Putin will win because of the disparity of size. And if Putin wins in Ukraine, there will be a new Iron Curtain. At the very least, there will be a new Iron Curtain in Eastern Europe and a new arms race in that important part of the world. And that's assuming that having taken Ukraine, he won't then go for the other parts of Greater Russia, of formerly Greater Russia, that he thinks rightly belong to Mother Russia. Right. And then in the Middle East, well, look, I'm not saying that Hamas acted at the instructions of Tehran, but Hamas is a creature of Tehran, just as Hezbollah is a creature of Tehran. And Tehran is completely committed to the obliteration of Israel, and the Israelis, understandably, are completely committed to their survival. And there is substantial risk of escalation. And I guess the difference between the militarist Putin on the one hand, the communist commissars in Beijing on the other hand, and the apocalyptic Islamists, is that at least Putin and Xi are broadly rational, whereas the apocalyptic Islamists are not rational in any meaningful sense. They believe that death in the pursuit of jihad is not something to be risked but avoided if possible. They think this is, in a sense, the culmination of life on Earth.
One final question, because our time's already up, Mr. Abbott. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific region and reframing the relationships there, I think the elephant in the room clearly is China. By all indications, China's economy is going to be in some sort of a slump, at least for the next 5 years. Do you think that's going to lead to some sort of a re-engineering of its own political system? Is it going to have any impact at all? Will the communist grip loosen? What do you think will happen to China, let's say, in the 5 years if the economy doesn't do well?
Well, I think the implicit deal that the communists have offered the Chinese people is you surrender your freedom to us and we will give you wealth. And this is why Taiwan is such a problem, because Taiwan shows that Chinese people can be both rich and free, indeed richer in Taiwan than they are in mainland China itself. So any significant slowdown in the Chinese economy is obviously going to threaten such legitimacy that the commissars have. And this is why I think an economically fragile China is more dangerous than an economically successful China, because dictatorships tend to look for a foreign adventure when they need to rally the people and distract the people, if you like, from their own domestic failings. So, yes, it does look like the Chinese economy is in a degree of trouble. Really not surprising, given that the market freedom that was significantly allowed in the post-Deng Xiaoping era has now been dramatically scaled back. Not surprising that the Chinese economy is in trouble. But rather than have them focus more domestically, it could actually drive a bit of adventurism abroad, which would be extremely problematic and dangerous for all of us.
Right. Mr. Abbott, we have completely run out of time, but I really appreciate the candor and the thoughtfulness that you brought to this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give Mr. Abbott a big round of applause.
Mr. Tony
Abbott,
so Sridharan, thank you very much for joining us here on the stage. Economically fragile China is perhaps more dangerous than a China doing well. I believe that's the message coming in as far as the global south
Absolutely,
is
Shweta.
concerned.
The Indo-Pacific, this century is of the Indo-Pacific, and like the Honourable former Prime Minister of Australia, he said it himself, the Quad is here to stay, and it is